Go right the way down the worldwide box office chart for 1992. The top 10, films like Aladdin, Batman Returns, Home Alone 2, Lethal Weapon 3. Scroll down a bit. 20, The Crying Game, Far and Away, Honey, I Blew Up the Kid. Scroll down a bit more. In the 30s, you've got Sneakers, Wayne's World 2, Malcolm X, The Distinguished Gentleman, Medicine Man. Hate to see that. And yet, if you keep going all the way down to 45th place, underneath Sleepwalkers, Stephen King film, just above Three Ninjas, known as Three Ninja Kids in the UK, is The Muppet Christmas Carol. How then did the 45th most popular film of 1992 become arguably the most popular Christmas film of all time?
We would be honored if you would join us.
Let's get into the story. The Muppet Christmas Carol came out in 1992, directed by Brian Henson, written by Jerry Jewell, and the cast led by the peerless Michael Caine, but also a whole bunch of Muppet performers in there as well. And, Dave Gold, Steve Whitmire, Frank Oz, Jerry Nelson. A bunch of people who have been bringing Muppets to life for much of their careers. It wasn't a movie starry cast. Apart from Michael Caine, of course, but still, this Muppet film came together almost in the aftermath of a tragedy, really, because on May the 16th, 1990, at the age of just 53, arguably the father of the Muppets, Jim Henson, passed away. The legendary creator of The Muppets, Fraggle Rock, The Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, just 53 years old. And he was at a little bit of a crossroads with The Muppets at the point where he passed away. I think Brian Smith did a terrific memoir of Jim Henson. I do hugely recommend it. And what do you do with these characters? Well, when Jim Henson died, it was Brian Henson, then in his mid to just past his mid-20s, who took on the role of the president of Jim Henson Productions. And he would tell The Independent many years later of that time when they made the decision to go forward with another Muppet film. And he just said it was all very risky. He said, even my dad wasn't sure what to do next with the Muppets. When he died, he was selling the company to Disney, and there's a whole bunch of books on it. I think Disney War by James B. Stewart goes into this a tiny bit as well. And so the big thing that he was going to do was Muppet attractions at Disney World theme park. He was getting very excited about that because I think he was unsure what to do next with the movies. The movies were tough because what we had at this point, the Muppet movie, the Great Muppet Caper, the Muppets Take Manhattan. And he just said, Brian Henson reconciled, you're trying to tell an original story, but with each movie, it was getting a little bit tricky. How do you let these characters be fresh? You kind of fall into ruts. But Brian Henson was keen to get a new Muppet film going. And in fact, before he died, one of the things that Jim Henson had been looking at was Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Is there a way to tell that particular story? And so, as Henson would reflect in a separate piece with The Guardian, he said, my father passed away. He'd done these 3 Muppet movies. And Brian Henson said, I didn't want too much of a direct comparison between me and my dad. So I thought, let's do something different. Our agent, Bill Haber, said to me, Christmas Carol is the greatest story of all time, the Charles Dickens story. You should do that. And he says, while I was thinking about it, he called me back and said, I've sold it to the ABC TV channel. This is now part of the Disney empire. And so this idea was now on the table. A Muppets film based in and around Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Now, there were all sorts of conflicting thoughts in Brian Henson's head on how to do this. He wasn't sure he wanted to direct it either, and I'll come to that shortly. He would admit in an interview with The Big Issue a few years ago that he was terrified at the idea of doing it. But first they had to crack, how on earth are you going to approach this Christmas Carol film? And he said, when we were putting together the Muppet Christmas Carol, it was going to be this TV special for ABC. And he talked to Entertainment Weekly about this. He said the idea was a long-form TV Christmas special. Goes out on television in America, this extra Muppet thing, great. And he said, I was comfortable directing that. But then he took a call from Disney and they were like, well, we could have this as a feature film. Now, this was an era where Walt Disney Pictures was being overseen by an executive called Jeffrey Katzenberg. His name comes up quite a lot in my stories. And Disney was entering an era where it liked the idea of having a new film in cinemas pretty much every week. I mean, that's what it would gear itself towards. And I mean, it would clearly veer itself away from that. But Jeffrey Katzenberg had looked at this Muppet project and just like, let's do it as a film. And that, as Brian Henson recalled, was when he got really nervous about it. And he says, I'll be completely honest, I tried to get other people to direct it. I was uncomfortable and terrified, frankly. Now, regular Muppets writer Jerry Jewell, by this stage, was fashioning a screenplay and fashioning this story, really. And at the point it became a film rather than a television project, well, the tone of it changed. This was now going to lean a lot more into the darkness of Charles Dickens' original text. They wanted to, they wanted to honour the original book. They wanted to put a spin on it. There was a long talk as well about doing it as a parody. But I mean, as Brian Henson would reflect again to Entertainment Weekly, he said Muppet movies were an old-fashioned comedy formula of 2 jokes a page. But leaning into Muppet Christmas Carol as it became, he said, this allowed me to actually create a world that was darker and more in sync with the stuff that I had done. And he said, that scared Disney. Jeffrey Katzenberg was enormously respectful to work with at Disney, but the notes would always come back. Could be a lot funnier whenever they read the script. But then they'd gone down the road of doing this parody of the Muppet, of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And Brian Henson stopped daft. He knew that's what audience were expecting from it. But I mean, the TV version was pretty much in line with that. When it became a film, it was Jerry Jewell who said, let's not make fun of it. Instead, let's play on this contrast between the Charles Dickens text and the approach of the Muppets. And so they'd had original ideas that they were going to make Robin the Frog the ghost of Christmas past. Miss Piggy could be the ghost of Christmas present. Animal, imagine this, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. But I mean, in terms of how to do it, at the point they turned it into the more Dickens version of the story, well, then it got to a decision of putting a character who didn't often step into the centre, Gonzo, as the narrator of the film. There was a bit of turmoil, really, within the Jim Henson Company on what to do with Kermit the Frog. Kermit the Frog had always been performed and voiced by Jim Henson. And now what do you do? How do you honour that? What do you do? Also, Kermit, always perceived as the head of the Muppets, would have made absolute sense to put him front and centre, but it's a Jim Henson character. And as Brian Henson would reflect to The Independent, he said Kermit could have played Charles Dickens, and then there would have been a lot more pressure on him. And the idea, he said, of Kermit instead playing Bob Cratchit just made sense in this world. But also what Jerry Jewell did, was just because Kermit, the inverted commas star of the Muppets, was going to take on the Bob Cratchit role, they resisted the temptation to beef that up and to add more lines and to give Bob Cratchit more screen time in the film. And so Brian Henson said, I was nervous about 2 things. One, is the audience going to say, I've screwed up Kermit and he's not good anymore? And 2, he said, is the audience going to say, this Muppet movie isn't funny and I only want Muppet movies that are really funny? And these were real tangible risks at this point. Now, it'd be Steve Whitmire who would come in to take on the job of voicing and performing Kermit the Frog. He would hold that through till 2017. But also, going back to how they were then going to write this and going back to how Gonzo ended up in the middle, they said, they stopped and looked at it and thought nobody really had captured the prose of Dickens on film, the way that he described the scenes. And so they'd like, well, we've got to put Charles Dickens in this film. And who is the question was, who is the least likely character in the Muppets to be Charles Dickens? And they're like, Gonzo. Gonzo. And so they said, we made him the storyteller. That in turn brought Rizzo the Rat to be his sidekick. And the script that Jerry Jewell put together, 95% up to that amount of what Gonzo says in the film is directly taken from the text of Charles Dickens. It's weird that one of the most loyal adaptations of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, right down to the language lifted off the page, comes in a 1992 Muppets film. Also, I mean, there was Jerry Nelson, legendary Muppets performer Jerry Nelson, who adored Gonzo. And by the end of Muppet Christmas Carol, I think most people adored Gonzo as well. And Brian Henson would say, I always felt there's so much more of Gonzo that we want to know about. And you've got Jerry Jewell on the one hand, who's really loving the writing of Charles Dickens, also wanting to get Gonzo in the film. And then this eureka moment was Charles Dickens, Gonzo crossed them over. There was still the question mark of directing, and Brian Henson was simply not keen to do it. Also, at the point in his life, he was in his 20s. He hadn't directed a feature film. He's lost his dad a year or two before, and does he really want to step into that? Right? Yeah. I mean, he'd grown up in and around the Muppets world. He performed on some of the Jim Henson films as well. He knew puppeteering. In fact, to this day, he does the Puppets Up work, and still he's partly in that world. But he just, in the end, it was Frank Oz who gave him the nudge. So Frank Oz, longtime creative partner of Jim Henson, the voice of Yoda, obviously, performer of Yoda, and Fozzie, had been in it from the Muppets right from the start, had directed a Muppet film as well. I mean, there was a candidate to do it. But it was Frank Oz who put the pressure on Brian Henson. And as Brian Henson told Entertainment Weekly, Oz went up to Brian Henson and said, you can do it. He says, I'll come, I'll be with you, I'll be there the whole time you're shooting. And that was pivotal to Brian Henson, but Frank Oz was there. And also, Frank Oz was going to be on the set. He was going to be performing these characters in the film. And so he was going to be around. So they knew then that they had a whole bunch of Muppets that were going to be written into the way that they were going to tell the story, but they needed a human. They didn't want a Muppet to play Ebeneezer Scrooge. They wanted a respectful actor to do it. So there were names in the mix. So George Carlin, I mean, sprung up through stand-up comedy primarily. From us in the UK, I think most of us learnt of him through the Bill and Ted movies. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey were out at this point. And so he was on the list, but in the end, he didn't get the call. And so they moved more towards English actors, people like David Hemmings, Ron Moody, David Warner. But, I mean, it's no spoiler to tell you, it's Michael Caine who took on the role of Ebeneezer Scrooge. And chatting to The Guardian, Henson said, when I met Michael Caine to talk about playing Scrooge, one of the first things he said was, I'm going to play this movie like I'm working with the Royal Shakespeare Company. I will never wink. I will never do anything Muppety. I'm going to play Scrooge as if it's an utterly dramatic role and there are no puppets around me. Straight away, he knew that was the tone of the performance. And I mean, Henson was like, he was intimidating to start with, but then you've got a 20-something director and an Oscar-winning actor. And so like the dynamic there is difficult anyway. But by the end, he's a delight, insisted Brian Henson. Now, Michael Caine's written a couple of memoirs. His first actually was written just as the Muppet Christmas Carol was about to come out. Is that one? What's it all about? And so the book sort of stops with him not knowing how it's going to go down. Now, many years later, he wrote Blowing the Bloody Doors Off. And he reflects in the Muppets in there, and he talks about his approach, and it comes back down to the RSC. He just says, I mean, he researched it. He just thought, you have to play comedy seriously. He'd just done Dirty Rotten Scoundrels with Frank Oz a couple of years ago, and he said, playing it seriously is what makes it funny. And so he said, I played him as if it was the Royal Shakespeare Company at the National Theatre. But also, he said, I researched him. I researched Ebeneezer Scrooge by watching CNN and following the trials and tribulations of all the Wall Street cheats and embezzlers of the time. And he said, there were plenty of them, as there always seemed to be, no comment. Now, he added later in his book as well, I mean, he talks about the impact of his family. He just says, as my family grew up, my priorities continued to shift. He said, when my mother needed a new house, I did Jaws the Revenge. Jaws the Revenge is famously the film where, many people know this, where Michael Caine would reflect. I'd never seen the film, but I have seen the house that it paid for, and it's very nice. Thank you very much. And so my agent, wrote Caine, a man called Dennis Selinger, thought it was a poor decision, but my bank manager loved it and Mum did too. So that's how he packaged up Jaws the Revenge. Now, Caine then said, when my daughter Natasha became old enough to watch movies, I realised it would be years until she'd be able to watch any of mine. I mean, the Ipcrest file doesn't tend to turn up on like family viewing channels. Caine admitted that these were all unsuitable viewing for a child. I mean, get Carter. I mean, yeah, all right. And he said, that's how I came to play Scrooge in the Muppet Christmas Carol. He wanted to make something that his daughter could watch. And he described it as a great experience at the time because the puppeteers are such gentle folk and a recurring joy. He just describes the film as a recurring joy every Christmas when we watch it all together as a family. Now, the script had come together then. They were heading for the shoot. And unlike most Muppet movies, there wasn't an attempt to shoehorn every character in this time. I mean, we've seen that in more recent times. The James Bobin directed The Muppets and Muppets Most Wanted. I'm very fond of both films. It almost becomes a joke about how they're going to get them in. In fact, you go to Muppet Treasure Island. Is it the Swedish Chef where they openly acknowledge, how else do you think we're going to get him in this movie? But they were a little bit more resistant. There was a tonal break, really, in the way that they'd done previous Muppet films with this one. And then there was the music. So Paul Williams had written the songs for the Muppet movie, including the wonderful, the peerless song Rainbow Connection. And when it came time to decide who's going to do the music for what was now the Muppet Christmas Carol, I go back to the words of Brian Henson. He just says, of everything that my dad had done, it seemed very clear that the songs that worked the best were the Paul Williams songs. The other songwriter whose songs really worked for the Muppets was John Denver, and John Denver and the Muppets had done a Christmas album as well. And of Paul Williams and Denver, Brian Henson would say, well, they're both folk artists, really. But he admitted, I always wondered why my dad hadn't done more with Paul after the Muppet movie. But then I found out it's because Paul had become a very self-destructive and had gone into a dark period of addiction. Now, Brian Henson was really nervous about the music of the film, and understandably so. You think the Muppets, you think music is part and parcel of it. And also, he said, I'd not done any musicals as a director or even as a performer, and I was really intimidated by trying to do any musical numbers and who to guide as songwriter. I just didn't know where to start. And so he just said, I'm going to track Paul Williams down. Let's find him and have the conversation. Now, Paul Williams' story is his to tell. It's in public record that around this time he got sober. And as Brian Henson said, he really wanted to prove that he was still a great songwriter. And they sent him the script and just said he really responded to the script because what's A Christmas Carol if not a story of redemption as well? And he said, I was thrilled to hear he was up for it, but I remember Disney were like, are you sure? Is he still working? And then he was fantastic. It was on the 11th of June, 1992 then, at Shepperton Studios, just outside London, that filming began on The Muppet Christmas Carol. The movie was going to be in cinemas 6 months later. This was going to be a tight shoot. But then a lot of the work of The Muppets is in camera, with exceptions this time that CG was going to be required. And so the sets had been built and designed to reflect both the darkness of Charles Dickens, but also the brightness of the Muppets, depending where you are at any particular bit in the film. But the music from Paul Williams had been put together with that in mind. It's no coincidence that, for instance, in the Marley and Marley sequence, you get the darkest, scariest bit of the film with one of the most upbeat songs at the end of it. They were very careful about how they positioned that together. The perils of shooting a Muppet film are, I mean, they're fairly legendary, really. If you go back to the Muppet movie, that opening number, Rainbow Connection, as a camera just basically glides across a swamp. Let me readjust my tinsel. There we go. Did you get that on the audio? Lovely. And you've got Jim Henson just crouched down, having to work for, 2-3 days to get that contorted into an unnatural position, and the skill of the performance is incredible. The sets had to be built with platforms and planks and little almost priest holes, really, that they could hide the Muppeteers in. It also meant the soundstage has to be raised up a little bit. And for the actors, I mean, bluntly, they have to watch where they're stepping, that these sets have been built specifically to accommodate the unusual demands of a puppet-populated production. So there's a making of documentary. It's only about 12, 13 minutes that's popped up on YouTube. And a lot of it is fairly like puff piece stuff. But right near the start of it, there's an overhead shot of the set. You just see how perilous the floor of the studio looks. If you then move on a little bit more in that documentary, you see the glorious Ghost of Christmas Present character being operated by Jerry Nelson with this remote control system that, let's just say, is a lot bigger than the remote control for your telly. They decided in the end with the three ghosts, past, present, yet to come, not to go with existing Muppets, to bring in new characters for those. And so you had these unusual ingredients for a Muppet production. You got the three brand new characters as the ghosts, and Michael Caine in the midst of it. And Brian Henson talked to Entertainment Weekly about directing Michael Caine. He just said, I realised the really good actors are way easier to work with because, fairly understandably, they really know what they're doing. They don't need as much directing. And he said Michael needed very little directing. It was like, this is about where the energy level should be in this moment, you'd say to him. And then he'd just do it. And Brian Henson did tell another story about directing him. He just says he was 28 when he was directing this, and he said, I didn't realise how hard it was to drop down onto your knees without using your hands. And so there's a scene in the film, mild spoiler, where Scrooge wakes up in the morning and he's pacing backwards and forwards and he's excited and the spirits have visited. He drops to his knees to thank the spirits that have visited him overnight. Then he stands back up because he's still so excited and runs to the window, opens it up. And Brian Henson asked Michael Caine to do this 3 times. And so Caine had put knee pads on under his trousers. And after the second take, he looked at his director and says, okay, Brian, I want you. I can't do a Michael Caine impression. I really can't. I want you right now to look me in the eyes and drop to your knees without using your hands and then stand up and repeat it. And that's exactly what Brian Henson did. And he's just like, oh, that's really hard. I can't do a Brian Henson impression either. And he just says, well, yeah, and I'm a lot older than you. And so it was hard for Caine to walk for a couple of days after that because it was a really hard thing to do for his knees. Caine didn't appreciate until halfway through. He didn't learn. It was a shock to him that it to learn it was Brian Henson's directorial debut. A compliment there writ large for Brian Henson. There were difficult sequences. CG worked in for, I don't know if anyone remembers the Commodore Amiga game Megalomania. Do you remember that from Sensible Software? It always struck me that 1 or 2 of the effects looked like they had a little bit of the glow of that game that was around at the time. But also, take the ice skating sequence, one of the hardest things for them to put on film. And there was clearly no ice. They put an empty hole in there. They had to digitally put in ice under the puppets. And so you had puppeteers underneath scooting around on chairs. Then the ice had to go in. And it was one of many very complicated sequences. But the reason I bring that up is at the end of that sequence, you get the shooting star going across the sky. And this was Brian Henson's tribute to his late father. It pops up fairly regularly in Muppet stuff now. And that was just like his moment for his dad in the midst of this film. Filming wrapped up middle of August 1992. So the release date of this film, right, we'll come to its actual release shortly. 11th of December 1992. This was the era before digital distribution. You want to send your film out into the world, you put it in film cans, all the prints have to be struck, then they have to be carried all around whichever country it's showing in. You couldn't then stagger the release of Muppet Christmas Carol much. There's no point releasing it in February. This had to be out by Christmas. I should point out one of the best modern Christmas films is The Holdovers, which came out before Christmas in America. Bizarrely, we got a January release for that in the UK. In the case of Muppet Christmas Carol, complete with a Drew Struzan, we just lost him, a Drew Struzan poster as well. This had to be ready in December. So it gave them basically 3 months of post-production, which included some digital effects work that needed doing as well. This was the first time that they could paint things out a little bit, for instance. And so the technology of the Muppets films was evolving, particularly on these. They used optical effects. They could erase rods and certain humans from shots. And so still pretty much in its infancy, but this was the year after Terminator 2, just to put it into some kind of context as to where the world was with CG at this point. Now, they then put together a cut of the Muppet Christmas Carol and they tested it. And Jeffrey Katzenberg sends his notes to the filmmakers. And Katzenberg had been fairly hands-off on the set of the film, that he was conscious he had a nervous director and a first-time director, and also all the emotions of stepping into his father's shoes. In fact, I think it was Dave Goltz who just said in an interview, we were ready, we'd finished grieving, we were ready to do this at this point. But still, it was a hell of a leap. And Katzenberg was aware of that and kept some of the machine of Disney away from the production. It helped it was shooting in London. I mean, the Muppets and the UK go hand in hand. But it helped it was shooting there because it's thousands of miles away from Disney's headquarters. But still, they were more hands-off than they needed to be, really. They did. When the test scores came in, when the test screening came in, Katzenberg's note was, it's the same as the script, could be a lot funnier. I didn't hear a lot of laugh out loud moments in the movie. And, as Brian Henson said, it's not really that kind of comedy. Now, they were already cutting songs out. If you've got the Muppet Christmas Carol soundtrack album, you see that you get the film Room in Your Heart, which doesn't make it into the final cut. You get Sam the Eagle singing Chairman of the Board as well. And they recorded these, but they didn't film them all because these things were just cut from the script just before shooting. And they just felt they just kind of slowed the story down a little bit, but the songs remain on the soundtrack. However, one song that was in that cut of the film that was tested was a non-Muppet song. The film stops for a couple of minutes, no Muppets in sight, and you get Michael Caine as Scrooge and you get Meredith Braun as Belle. And the song is When Love Is Gone. It is, it's a really striking sequence in the film. Brian Henson always argued it was absolutely pivotal to the movie, to the emotion of the movie, to the structure of the movie, to why it worked. But Jeffrey Katzenberg didn't like it. Katzenberg, Brian Henson would learn, did not like ballads in his films. And he discovered later on that across umpteen Disney films, Katzenberg had pushed back against ballads that kind of, in his eyes, slowed films down, and kids didn't like ballads, was the argument. Now, Brian Henson at this stage was a 20-something first-time director. He is arguing with basically the head of the studio, the person who has to sign off on this. And I think he's reflected a few times since that had he been a bit older, he might have pushed and fought back on this more than he did. But at this point in time, he agreed. I mean, he went with Katzenberg and they didn't have a fractious relationship. The song came out, but the idea was that it would end up on the home formats release when it came on video, when it came on Laserdisc, that the full complete song would be in the midst. And so that's where a lot of us saw it. That, it popped up and just like, I don't necessarily remember that in the cinema, but the cinema release was coming. Let's deal with that. It goes into cinemas on the 11th of December, 1992. The critical response to the film, I would suggest, was on the very good to pretty good to very good. And there was some pushback against the tonal change that had been that was on show in the film. That this wasn't your usual anarchic Muppet film. It was going up against like some really tough films as well. If you look at the competition it was against, it was like Home Alone 2, Aladdin, stuff like that. And tonally, it's really different to both of those films. Some people, however, really respected how closely it went to the Dickens text, but that also invited another bunch of criticism, because now if you're a Charles Dickens purist, well, was the film for you? Is this really a respectful handling of his text? There was quite a lot of backwards and forwards with it. And the fact that, on the one hand, it goes really quite dark, and it really does. And then you've got it contrasting with these Muppets. And the songs as well came in just for a bit of a minor kicking, really. So, it had a tough job on its hands. There's no way around that. It goes into cinemas in 1992 as something of like an outlier in the end. It hadn't, I should note, cost Disney an awful lot of money to make the film. The quoted budget of the Muppet Christmas Carol is $12 million. You know, if I had $12 million, it's the kind of thing I'd pay for myself. By the time it comes out, it opens in 6th place at the US box office. The number one film the weekend of the 11th to the 13th, 1992, in the US of December, was A Few Good Men, which opens with 15.5 million. Second place, Home Alone 2 on its 4th week has crossed 4 million. The Bodyguard is in 3rd. Aladdin is in 4th. Eddie Murphy in The Distinguished Gentleman, an underrated film that from Jonathan Lynn, who did My Cousin Vinny and Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister over here. And then in 6th place is The Muppet Christmas Carol, just ahead of Malcolm X, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Passenger 57, A River Runs Through It as well. $5 million. No, it's not Home Alone money, is it? And then by week 2, the expectation was this will grow over Christmas and it will be a film that people will want to seek out over Christmas. So on its 2nd week of release, its number drops by 18%. It's down to 7th place. With 4 million. Few Good Men still at the top. There's Aladdin. There's Home Alone 2. Mel Gibson in Forever Young opens in 4th. The Bodyguard in 5th. Robin Williams in the fascinating film Toys is in 6th. And down in 9th place is an underrated Steve Martin movie, Leap of Faith. I've covered it on the Film Stories podcast before. Muppets, though, it's just not. By week 3, it's out of the top 10. Down to 11th place over the Christmas weekend, where everyone else's box office is going up. The Bodyguard's box office shoots up 60% Christmas weekend. Few Good Men, it's up 22%. Aladdin's up 85%. Forever Young is up 36%. 2 films in the top 15 dropped box office that week, Christmas week. One was Toys, the other Muppet Christmas Carol. So by the time it leaves US cinemas, the Muppet Christmas Carol has $27 million to its name. Outside of the US, I don't have the full number, but it wasn't an awful lot more. It's just a few million here and there. And so, off you go to the video release. So we gave it a go, tried, that's it. Only it wasn't. And over time, it's not a box office flop, but I'm going to call it what it is, the 45th most popular film of 1992, gradually on video, on television, then Laserdisc, then DVD, and now streaming, built its audience. And also cinema re-release culture, I think, helped a little bit as well. That as we headed into the 2000s, cinemas were getting wiser to the idea of let's put Christmas films back on in cinemas, and people, even if they've got the video or the disc, might come and watch them. And now, I'm recording this in 2025, where my local multiplex will be showing The Polar Express, they'll be showing Die Hard, they'll be showing The Muppet Christmas Carol, they'll be showing Elf, they'll be showing Home Alone. Even The Holiday now is on that circuit. No disrespect to The Holiday, but even The Holiday now is on that circuit. But I would suggest chief among them has become the Muppet Christmas Carol sing-along. And every year, without fail, there it is. There's now a concert, orchestra events where you can watch the Muppet Christmas Carol with a live orchestra. And this $12 million film, the 45th most popular film of its year, I would suggest, has never been more popular. It pops up as one of, I would say, the 3 most popular Christmas films. If you're trying to give the posh answer, you say, my favourite Christmas film is It's a Wonderful Life, which is an amazing film. If you're choosing the one you're more likely to watch, you go for Muppet Christmas Carol or Die Hard. These are the ones that have emerged at the top of the list. But of course, the story's not done, because there's that song, When Love Is Gone. And so cut out by the test screenings. Then it emerges on the initial home releases. But then by the time we get to DVD, it's gone again. No, it's not in the extra features. It's not anywhere. This song has disappeared. And it turns out Disney no longer has the negative for it. And it's gone. And so every year the request goes in, can we have the restored version of it? It's gone. The footage no longer exists. Now, you could have fudged it together from one of the earlier home releases, but the actual source material disappeared. Brian Henson never wanted to lose it and became quite tenacious about trying to get it back and would inquire of Disney, have you got it? Have you got it? He would ask time and time and time again. And so he would regularly check in the Disney archive. It wouldn't appear. But then, as he told Entertainment Weekly, after years and years and years, and telling them, you have an obligation to find this, you have to find it, they found what was described as a first strike into positive of a reel of the Muppet Christmas Carol. He says everyone was looking for the negatives, but then someone said to him, this is nerdy, I found an IP of reel 4 of A Christmas Carol. And Henson was just like, oh, flip, I think he said, that's it. And he knew that that was to the standard that they needed. He was told this by Disney. He was given the news as Muppet Christmas Carol's been restored into 4K. And we got the news in 2020 that finally a restored version was going to bring this song back to the film. And so a year or so later, Muppet Christmas Carol goes on the Disney Plus streaming service. You have to go into the extras on the menu. You're not offered a choice of the 2 cuts of the film straight up. It's in the extras to find the version that Brian Henson most wanted to put out into the world. It exists. I'm glad about that. I got a chance to interview Brian Henson when he made a film called The Happy Time Murders, which came out back in 2018. And I asked him this. I just says, do you have any idea what you did? And does he get a chance to appreciate that a film he put into the world like decades before has become so special to so many people, has become a part of people's Christmas ritual? And he just said, I don't really stop enough and think about it, but did say it is lovely how popular and lasting that film is, particularly in Britain. And I'm recording this in Britain. I'd do a search now, I'd find you 50, 100 screenings over the coming weeks of his film. The movie is, of course, dedicated to Jim Henson, also to Richard Hunt, another Muppet legend who passed in 1992. Ultimately, it's a tribute to what you can get coming through grief, I suppose, to a degree, something I'm actually in the midst of at the moment, that the channeling of it into something positive, the willingness to be a little bit disloyal and break the rules that your father had set, really, and try and do things in a slightly different way. And just this beautifully crafted, joyous, funny, warm, human film that brings so many people so much joy is the ultimate tribute to them all. They didn't need to dedicate it to people like Jim Henson and Richard Hunt and, people who have left us since. Their work is on the screen, on a big screen, every single Christmas, and will be long after I've gone as well. The 45th most popular film of 1992 is now arguably the most popular family Christmas movie of all time. How about that?